Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Gemma Abbott. I'm the Legal Director at Good Law Project. I feel genuinely honoured to be hosting this event with such incredible guests. We're here today to talk about open source journalism and how it can be used to hold power to account. I've heard open source journalism compared to mosaic building, so the art of revealing a story largely from freely available public sources, sifting through the data, finding the links, compiling it all in a context where we can understand it and digest it. And that can be from government records and archives, or more often in our hyper-digital age, from the data, metadata of millions of photos, recordings, social media posts. But it's far more, obviously, than just internet research. It's a fight against misinformation. It's a rigorous, thoroughly evidenced pursuit of the truth. And it's a powerful means of exposing wrongdoing and seeking accountability. And our guests today have been pioneers of these practices that have been used to reveal extraordinary truths about the world we live in and those who seek to control it. And I know that you're not here to listen to me, so let me introduce them. Starting first with Elliot Higgins. He's the founder and director of Bellingcat, a collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists. Together, they've used open source data to great effect in recent years, from uncovering human rights abuses to tracking the use of chemical weapons. Their investigations have made headlines here and around the world, not least when they successfully identified the Russian intelligence officers suspected of poisoning the Skripals in Salisbury. Bellingcat are focused now on the war in Ukraine, and they've played a key role in revealing the extent of the devastation, mapping incidents of civilian harm, the use of cluster munitions, and the disinformation campaign being waged by Russian troll farms. His book, We Are Bellingcat, is out now in paperback. Carol Cadwallader is an author, investigative journalist, and features writer. She found herself in the spotlight in 2016 when The Observer began publishing a series of articles that connected tech, social media, and the seedy right-wing ecosystem. And since then, she's covered the dodgy practices and illicit funding of the Vote Leave campaign and the links between Vote Leave, Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, Russia, and dark money. She worked with whistleblower Christopher Wiley to publish her investigation into Cambridge Analytica, which forever changed how we view Facebook's use of user data. Carol's work has won a Polk Award and the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism, and she was named a Pulitzer Prize finalist for national reporting in 2019. Russell Scott is Good Law Project's first investigative journalist. Before he joined our ranks in 2021, he'd already made a name for himself as a tenacious investigator. His investigations have been published in Open Democracy, The Guardian, Greenpeace, The Times, and The Mirror. As part of Good Law Project, he's helped us to expose the government's VIP lane for COVID contracts and government's misuse of private email channels, scouring thousands of pages of government disclosures. I once described him as a bloodhound in human form. I'm hopeful he took it as a compliment then, seeing as I've repeated it now, but he absolutely is. So in terms of the format for this evening, we'll start with some pre-prepared questions, but we're also really keen to hear from you, our audience. So if you have any questions for Elliot, Carol, or Russ, please do pop them in the comments below and we'll get through as many as we can. So to kick things off, Elliot, I'd really like to turn to you first. I've read your book, and I find it utterly fascinating. And I think you've really succeeded, in my humble opinion, in convincing the reader that the work of guarding society and upholding truth, it's not just the preserve of elites or institutions, actually it's for all of us. And in part, I think this sense of accessibility comes from your own journey, which is obviously not that of a traditional journalist. I understand in the past you've attributed your skill not to sort of specialist knowledge of international conflicts or digital data, but to the hours spent playing video games, which gave you the idea that any mystery can be cracked. So how has the work of Bellingcat developed in recent years, and what do you see as the future for your model of investigative journalism?
So I think really our focus over the last few years has been taking the process of open source investigation, which is basically made up by a bunch of amateurs and people experimenting and eventually finding something that worked, into something that's a professional field of investigation. Part of that is getting to the point where there's a kind of almost Bellingcat kite mark of quality when it comes to investigations. And we've established that through developing a new process for investigation that's focused on accountability. And that means our case files that we create through this process involve archiving information, even archiving the investigation process itself automatically. So in the future, it can be reviewed by courts or anyone who might want to use it. And following a process that addresses the issues of legal accountability processes, really the who, what, why, where, and how of these cases discovered through open sources. But it's also not intended to tell the complete story, because obviously there's more than just open source information. But the way we kind of envision it is that we'll provide a very detailed open source investigation, and then other people will provide other kinds of material from their expertise to these processes. And we've developed that initially from 2018 onwards, focusing on Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, and we're now applying that to the conflict in Ukraine. And because we've taken the time to establish that process, it means now we have something that we can go to these accountability bodies and say, look, this is what we've developed. They often know that we've been developing this, so they already know that we've been engaging with them and they trust this process. And it means now that not only do we have a process that we can use in our own investigations, but it gives us a process that we can teach other people to use. And we can also show people the value of doing this level of quality of work. But it still doesn't mean that we're abandoning the kind of more editorial side of our investigations. It just means that I think with open source investigation, there can be many different kinds of outcomes. There can be kind of more traditional journalistic outcomes. There can be more legal outcomes. And it's possible to address both of those using the same evidence, just slightly different processes. So it's really been about knowing that we can investigate stuff to this high quality. And we've done this for years with things like Syria and MH17, but now also having a process that means that we can take those investigations and actually use them directly for accountability.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Thank you very much. Turning to you, Carol. Firstly, I just wanted to say, seeing as I've managed to find myself in this position, how much I admire your tenacity and determination in the face of such vicious, often extremely misogynistic attacks. So it's a real honor to have you with you.
Thank you.
With us. Thank you. Can you tell us about how you work as an open source investigator? So you've been uncovering all these amazing stories. Like, do you work on them alone with the team behind you?
So it's funny. I mean, I wouldn't actually. I mean, I'm not an open source investigator. Okay. I am. No. It's really interesting. You know, I am very much. I came up through journalism, and I've very much predominantly been. You know, I started out in news. I became a feature writer, and then I accidentally became an investigative journalist, and that was through. It turned out that. You know, for me, it was very mystical and sort of mysterious and exclusive and exclusionary investigative journalism. It was something that sort of, you know, that men in sort of like darkened rooms did while smoking a cigarette and like going through, like understand, you know, this sort of like high level financial stuff. And, you know, my route into investigative journalism was through chatting to people. Turned out like that was my major skill, was just talking to people. And so I sort of started doing investigative journalism before I even realized that I was doing investigative journalism. And a lot of that was through, you know, just looking at stuff on the internet. I mean, essentially it's what we all do. I mean, it was, you know, I don't know, it's that sort of like somebody was sort of saying, you know, the thing of like tracing one's ex-boyfriend through Facebook. That was a really key way that to like understanding these skills. But essentially what happened is that when I started off on the Cambridge Analytica kind of like weird, totally crazy journey that was, there were no journalists essentially doing, you know, there was 2 journalists in Switzerland who sort of like were looking at the story. But there was a tiny little group of people I found on Twitter, and there was a couple of academics I found, and there was a lawyer or 2, and through it. So what happened is throughout that sort of entire investigation and right up to the present day, actually my kind of journalistic colleagues in a way weren't in the traditional newsroom. They were distributed over Twitter and coming from very different sort of disciplines and backgrounds. And actually the people who would just find the nugget of information somewhere and turn it up on Twitter, that has been and still is a really vital sort of source of information. And one of the things, I did a panel with Elliot a couple of weeks ago, and or maybe I read it in your book first, Elliot, and then we talked about it at the panel. But one of the things I love about open source investigation is that it because it approaches the problem differently from journalism, and in many ways it's just much more democratic and accountable and non-elitist and inclusive, and they're all sort of things which I really like. And so in journalism, the whole traditional sort of practice and is that you hang on to your facts and you hang on to your story and you guard your scoop, and that's the most important thing, to be able to say exclusive over the front page. And like one of my key learnings, which I did have to learn along the way, is that actually if you give your story away and you share it, is that it becomes bigger, because we know what happens when something's only reported in one newspaper, i.e. The Guardian, and it's not reported anywhere else. It just doesn't take hold in the same way, and it doesn't become a political issue. So actually sort of like getting other organizations, especially in the world we're living in, which is that, you know, the competition shouldn't be with news organizations. It should be between facts and lies. And but working in this sort of collaborative way does not come naturally at all to journalists. And I think this thing of showing your workings, putting stuff out into the public domain, if you can't use it, perhaps there's somebody else who can. And essentially, I mean, that's what I say that I consider myself a journalist, and that's not an open source investigator. But I think that the way that I use Twitter, and I've taken to using Twitter, is more of an open source investigative mindset, which is I just put stuff out. I put stuff out. I can't publish it. It's actually really hard to publish a shit ton of stuff. And it's, you know, you've got to find the right moments. You've got to have, you know, get it past your editor. There's a high. And so actually, you know, I think I only sort of realized this recently, was that I was like, you know what, on a lot of these topics, I am actually the biggest publisher in Britain in some ways. I've published, you know, I'm treated as a publisher under British law, as I've, you know, dealing with another legal letter in the last couple of days, I can tell you. But yeah, anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question or if it's gone really badly off course, Gemma. But
no, it's so interesting. And I think that sort of way of collaborative working is not necessarily something that comes that easily to lawyers either.
No,
and so I think it's really, what you said about, you know, it really shouldn't be between news organizations, just as it really shouldn't be between law firms, campaigning organizations. We have a kind of common goal, right? And I think it would be, I think a real lesson for everyone.
Water people.
Yeah, I really agree. Thank you. That's really helpful and interesting. And Russ, to turn to you, obviously we work very closely together at Good Law Project, in particular at the points at which your investigations sort of intersect with, or indeed even prompt our litigation. I'd love to hear you tell our audience more about how open source information supports our cases.
Yeah, sure. I think what Carol just said a second ago about sort of open source information being able to sort of level the playing field is true. It means NGOs like Good Law can get access to this information. It's not get guarded by journalists as such. And there's some really useful websites out there that we use to track down information. In particular on our procurement cases, it really helps to sort of give us an insight into what's going on. You know, why did this company worth pennies, you know, before COVID is suddenly worth, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds? How does that happen? So there's websites like the government's contracts finder, where there's a huge database of information there that the public can search contracts and find out, you know, who's winning these vast sort of sums of money. You can then sort of correlate that with electoral commission databases, see if any of these companies are donating to political parties. Companies House is a great resource for finding out who controls these companies, and sort of that combination of those websites and combined with things like LinkedIn and stuff have just been really useful to piecing together, you know, where billions of pounds of our money in effect is going and being wasted.
Yeah.
And I think that really helps inform our cases. And it can also be done in a way where we can pull in media partners, you know, such as BBC and Guardian and things like that, put it on social media, and it really helps boost our sort of presence online, amplify our cases. And I think that the sort of two can work hand in hand. I also think at the minute where a lot of traditional newsrooms at the big sort of mainstream media outlets are shrinking sort of their investigative journalism teams, that gap is being filled by NGOs and other organisations. And, you know, in the case of supporting our legal work, we're also putting out decent investigations that in collaboration with mainstream media. And I think there's a definite need for it.
I mean, I completely agree. Obviously, the law can be a powerful tool, but it's only one tool, and we can't. You know, Good Law Project, we bring a lot of cases, obviously, but we can't bring cases over everything, and there are a lot of things to expose. And I just, you know, I think the two are incredibly complementary. I think I've never been so happy as when Russ joined Good Law Project, and I could stop trying to do my very own rudimentary open source investigations using boastful people on LinkedIn and the sort of lack of circumspection on Twitter. But yeah, Russ applying his professional skills to things have really taken it to the next level for us. It's been amazing. Elliot, if I could return to you, could I ask just a bit more about what the work that you're doing in Ukraine at the moment? How you're using sort of open source investigations to play a role there?
Yeah, so we've had a few phases so far. There's kind of the pre-invasion period where we were focused more on, first of all, setting up a kind of coalition of organizations who were working on similar things. So we contacted the Center for Information Resilience, who had been geolocating and collecting videos of things like troop movements in Russia, which were very well documented by Russian TikTok users. Probably China has provided more information about Russian troop movements than anyone else in this conflict, funnily enough. And the Conflict Intelligence Team, which is a Russian-based organization who focuses a lot on identifying units and those kind of things. So we kind of brought that coalition together, and we were looking at disinformation that was being produced by separatist groups. So, for example, there was a faked IED attack where they used autopsied cadavers as the victims that they put in the car and burnt it, and then fired a machine gun into the side of to pretend it was an explosion and it was shrapnel. But thanks to some a local video blogger filming the bodies a bit too closely, we could see all the autopsy cuts and other grim things like that. So I spent a very unpleasant morning looking at autopsy, how to do an autopsy, and if those cuts on the skull are from a bone saw or not. So that was an unpleasant education. But that's an example of how far they were going for kind of disinformation. And the problem with disinformation is the more authentic you try to make it look, the more often that you leave clues that it's not authentic. So obviously using bodies as a prop in a fake video gives us some more clues. So then we had the invasion, and what we started doing then is collecting videos of civilian harm incidents. What we've learned over the years is in the initial weeks and months of a conflict, a lot of the material that's shared online gets lost. So preservation of that material is very important, because you'll often see potential war crimes that need documenting. And if we don't collect that evidence, it's lost forever, because accountability processes are, slow, and they take a long time to get set up. And even now, even though there are accountability processes being set up, they aren't ready to go yet, which means they can't collect evidence and preserve stuff. So we understand that as almost the front line of kind of collecting this open source evidence, you also have almost a duty to archive and preserve this evidence to a standard that means it can be used in the future. And that's not as simple as downloading a video. It means that we have to download it as a hashed file and save it in a secure archive, and also add metadata to it, like the location it was filmed. Now, that was made a lot easier because around what happened in Ukraine is a community that of basically volunteers, self-organizing, ad hoc, anarchic community of people who are just geolocating stuff, discussing stuff, IDing stuff. It's interesting to see. You've probably seen these people who pop up who have very specialized interests. Like there's one guy who knows a lot about military supplies and truck maintenance, and he's doing really interesting things on describing exactly what's going wrong. So you get all those kind of people contributing. You also get people who are just, see these geolocations almost as a puzzle. You've got people like the Oris blog who are doing a visual count of every destroyed and captured vehicle on both sides of the conflict. So we've got like this really accurate impression. And for us, it's really about collecting as many of these videos as possible of civilian harm and verifying them. And we have an internal volunteer group who are trained specifically to verify these images. We then review them and it goes onto a database. So we are now we have published a map on a platform called Time Map, which is produced by a partner we've worked with in the past, Forensic Architecture, that allows anyone to look through all those ones we've shared online. I think we're over 420 instances now of civilian harm. We're moving into a phase now where we've set up 2 investigation teams. One is a more kind of editorial focused investigation team, which is more kind of traditional, more journalistic, well, the Bellingcat way of doing journalism kind of output. And on the other side, we've got a justice and accountability team, and they're completely separate because they are focused entirely on investigations that are intended for accountability purposes in the future. So we developed this process through investigating Saudi airstrikes in Yemen. That was developed with the Global Legal Action Network. We tested it in a mock trial on Yemen that we ran with Swansea University Law. We've spoken to people who've worked in the accountability sector at places like the IIIM on Syria, which is collecting evidence to do with crimes in Syria for the UN General Assembly, where they've done a lot of work on digital evidence and they understand the needs of their process from open source evidence. So the entire process is intended to deliver a kind of complete package of investigation, but we only focus on open source investigation. And that's because if we start bringing in things like interviewing witnesses or collecting videos from people who email to us, that actually changes the kind of chain of custody requirements quite dramatically, and it's not something we're set up to do. So as I mentioned before, the way we see it is we do the one thing we do really, really well and make sure it's useful and accessible to the accountability processes. And then within the community of people doing similar things but in different areas, like there's one organization at the moment collecting the this leaked radio conversations of Russian soldiers being streamed online constantly, and they're downloading all of those and they're going to tag them with information like who could be speaking in it, where it was likely recorded, and then we can combine that with the open source data. But the accountability processes receive that, and they can do that combination themselves and still combine that with their more traditional investigation process. So that's kind of my kind of vision of how accountability works with all this open source information. You can't do everything yourself, but you can design processes where it feeds into these accountability processes, and that's what we're doing at Bellingcat at the moment.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So thank you. I think it's all I can really say is pretty awe-inspiring, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about it. So thank you very much. Carol, you're obviously a very experienced journalist, but over the last few months, you've found yourself as the subject rather than the author. How do you feel about the journalist becoming the subject? What do you think it tells us about the state of play in the UK in 2022?
Are we allowed to swear in this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Scottish. The air is blue around me.
I think it shows. I'll try and do the cleaned up version.
Okay.
It basically shows how fecked we really are. No, I mean it's a disaster. I think. I mean it's you know, as a journalist you should never be the story. I mean that's just like the basic #1 rule. And the point is that the subject of my investigation, who took this legal action against me, successfully took the heat off himself, made me the story, and silenced all reporting and investigation into him. So it's a disaster, I have to say. And I think the coverage and understanding of this in the sort of like media landscape is been very poor. And, you know, the only thing I can say to that is it just shows how effective these propaganda techniques are, because essentially this particular case, I think, has been seen, if it's been seen at all, which it hasn't had much visibility in the sort of wider media sphere, as almost like a personality conflict. Like, oh, it's Carol versus Aaron, and she went too far, and there's this kind of, you know, weird, almost like a Twitter spat, but playing out in a courtroom, and really not understanding that, you know, that is essentially because for 5 years, that is the way, you know, I've been targeted. and I've been made into that figure, a very controversial, polarizing figure. And that's a result of doing investigative journalism. And for that reason, the fact that actually the wider story here, which is about the biggest donor to Brexit, we still don't know where that money came from. I mean, and that's a fact.
Yeah.
But there's been no continued investigation into that. Instead, essentially, there's been this spectacle. It's been turned into a spectacle, which is the witch must be burned, burn her. So that's kind of like how it feels, how it's felt. But but that's why, to be honest with you, just to go on to it, I always find it so inspiring listening to Elliot speak, and this way of, I really think there's so much that journalism needs to learn from this open source community. And it is a community, much more than journalism is. And I think one of the things which just sort of struck me so much when you're talking, Elliot, is I love the way that you've got your two streams, your journalistic investigations, and then this thing, your justice and accountability. And, Gemma and Russell, what you're doing at Good Law, you're coming at it from the justice and accountability angle, and then sort of bringing it over into journalism in that way. And what we're doing, so at the Citizens, which is the organisation which I've helped co-found, and that is we're coming at it from the investigative journalism side. But the reason for setting that up and feeling that there was this need is because I really care about why, I'm doing this. I was I've been doing this journalism and, working all hours for God knows how many years now, because it's felt that there is something really important at stake. And that, I've been in this position to ring the alarm bell about it. And it's not enough for me to just, I've never been motivated by I want my story on the front page of the newspaper. I really don't give a toss about that. It really is about outcomes and about impact and about changing things. And that model of impact journalism, campaigning journalism, it's kind of out of fashion. I was told it's never been a broadsheet thing really in Britain. It's like the tabloids used to do it to a certain degree, although around stupid subjects half the time. And so, I feel that we're all coming at it from different angles, but we're all sort of meeting in the middle. And I just, I love this idea of exactly justice and accountability being at the heart of this work. Yeah, I mean, that's what it's about, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you. That's such an interesting answer. And I can see we've got some really good questions coming in about some of these issues, I think, Carol, that you feel haven't been explored, that around Brexit, perhaps. I think we'll have a long conversation about that probably tonight. We don't have time, but about lawfare, about, how powerful people can use the law, misuse the law, to silence people who just are scrutinizing them and trying to hold them to account. So I think we'll come on to that. But I have one last question for Russ before we come on to audience questions, if that's all right, Russ. So one of my favorite things at work is when you share the results of your Freedom of Information Act requests. Not normally, to be honest, when they first come back from government, because invariably at that point they've made some spurious reason up why they can't reply to you. But normally once they've gone through the ICO process, and then you've forced them to provide you with the information that you want. So can you explain to the audience how citizen journalists can use the Freedom of Information Act to access important information? Yeah,
sure. I think, alongside sort of open source information, Good Law uses FOI very frequently to sort of get information that isn't yet in the public domain, and then help put it in public domain subsequently afterwards. I think it's just a great tool. There's a lot of things wrong with FOI. The time government departments are taking to respond, the fact that the ICO is incredibly under-resourced and it just takes months to get cases anywhere. But that aside, it's still a good tool to get information, and anyone sort of interested should really check out a website called What Do They Know? and that sort of helps you guide you through the process. But the theory is, you can put a request into any government department, any local authority, any regulator, and ask them to provide you with information. Now, it's not necessarily as straightforward as that, but that is the sort of the reason for it. And at Good Law, we've used it quite successfully in tracking down winners of our procurement cases. Is one example. We spent 9 months battling with the Department of Health to release the names of the 50 or now 68 companies that were awarded contracts sort of worth about £5 billion via the government's illegal VIP channels. That was off the back of an FOI, and then combined with open source sort of information to find out who these people were, how they were connected to the Conservative Party. Very similar to what Carol's team at the Citizens do as well. FOI, we also use FOI to uncover the fact that you can get hold of really good data sets via FOI. So we were able to find that private healthcare providers, for example, were given £1.5 billion during a pandemic, even though they supplied something like less than 1% of the overall care. Again, that's sort of information that the government spent a year trying not to publish. FOI is a really good way at forcing them to publish. And yeah, it's just been a really useful tool for us, and I would recommend any sort of would-be journalist to sort of get their head around it and use it, because it's free.
Thanks.
But it's stressful.
Yeah, can be a bit, but yeah, when you're doing it, it's not stressful for me. But yeah, it's been such a powerful tool, because as you say, there's information that you just can't get your hands on otherwise. Ideally we would have a world where government did everything transparently, but we don't. So it's one of the few tools actually available to shine some light into those shadows, I think. So we're going to move on to audience questions, and I have been reliably assured that they were just going to pop up on the screen. They did. Amazing. That was really impressive. Thank you, team. So there's a question from Penny, and it sort of brings us back to something that you were talking about, Carol, but to be honest, has affected everybody on the panel. So given libel laws can be used to repress investigations, how do you consider the law should be changed? And so, yeah, I know, Carol, you've obviously been involved in an extremely high profile chilling defamation case with Aaron Banks.
Well, Elliot is the one who should talk on this.
Well,
he's the most exciting new libel case here.
Yeah, Elliot has a very interesting new libel case that probably the lawyers will prevent him from talking about too specifically, but we've seen in the press this week. Yeah.
Yes, who's suing you, Elliot?
It's Yevgeny Prigozhin, also known as Putin's chef. He is, I've got to be really careful what I say here. He is someone who's sanctioned in the UK, US, and EU for a number of reasons, including his involvement with the Internet Research Agency and the interference in the 2016 election. He's actually has an FBI wanted poster for that. And I've damaged his reputation, and he's taken me to court for that. His lawyers have recently pulled out of that case because of some recent changes that may have occurred. So our next court hearing's in a couple of weeks in April, and that will be probably deciding if this case goes ahead or not.
Well, it's so discreet that they've, I think, tried to remove themselves from the process. But I mean, I think your lawyers, Elliot, described it as an obvious case of strategic litigation against public participation, so the so-called SLAP case. And, I think, as I say, I think everyone here knows the sort of chilling, silencing effect that this can have. And I mean, just last week, Dominic Raab announced government plans to take aim at SLAP suits. So ideas that they're discussing include a strengthening of the public interest defence in the Defamation Act, capping costs that can be recovered by claimants to stop, the super rich weaponising the high cost of litigation to stifle free speech. Do you feel, Carol Russ, that that's going far enough? Do you think there's further legal protections that we should be looking at? What
that doesn't even work. I mean, the damages, in my case is that it's like I'm looking at £1 million in costs, but the damages will be something like £10,000. I mean, the damages are neither here nor there. That's not what it's about. It's about making it impossible for journalists to defend this. And, you know, the crazy thing is that, you know, the crazy thing in my case is that he didn't sue the multi-million-pound international media organizations who, you know, one was a publisher and one, you know, published the previous reports on it. But bizarrely, this is where it comes to the kind of like, you know, it comes actually back round full circle to what we're talking about. Bizarrely is that if he had sued the Guardian would have settled, because the Guardian does not go to trial, it settles. And you know, lawyers essentially know that as well these days. And the reason why, I mean, I kind of like, I was desperate to settle before I, you know, ended up in courts. It was a terrible time for me before trial, but, you know, I couldn't for various reasons. But the thing which did enable me to was this fact that I was supported. It was like very much the public, you know, the crowd, the citizens who did, like, you know, fund and support me. And in that way, it's made me a more difficult adversary, in a sense, even than the sort of the, you know, traditional media organizations. And so that it is an interesting dynamic going on at the moment. But I think, you know, that one of the things, just in terms of how they need to change the law, one thing that they've talked about is they need to have this really speedy identification process where they're going, maybe the guy, like maybe this PreInvasion chap suing Elliot, you know, maybe we could look at this one early and throw this out rather than going through 2.5 years of litigation before it goes to trial, before we then, you know, bring in the other stuff. So that I think is really, really crucial, that there needs to be some sort of early warning system, with particularly around sort of politically exposed people.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Russ, I can see lots of questions coming in on FOI as well. So I'm going to save some of them for you. So I'm hoping the next question is going to pop up on the screen. I'm so impressed by this. It's seamless. So this is a question from John. He says, given that many of the OSI sources are government sources, what do you make of the mindset of government ministers that they still do dodgy deals without knowing that the information is available to be found? Does anybody want to volunteer to take that one? I have some thoughts, but
yeah, I'll jump in first. Yeah, I mean, one thing I do enjoy is when we move into a new region of the world and start doing open source investigations, because if we catch the government doing something, they inevitably deny it, and they don't know what they're in for, because we are much better prepared than they are to deal with this kind of information. Like when we were looking into the we did a project with the BBC called Anatomy of a Killing, looking at the murder of 2 women and 2 children at this roadside, or women and 2 children rather. And we identified as it being in Cameroon, and the Cameroonian government gave a press conference where they had the video with the words "fake news" written underneath it. And that was like a red rag to a bull to us. That just drove us on even further. And we managed to find the exact names of the people who were responsible, exactly where it happened and when it happened. And within a year, all of those people were jailed for those murders. And the government basically had to completely reverse their position. And they were not prepared for what we were able to bring to force on that. And I think, I mean, we've seen this certainly with the Russian government. I think we've surprised them with the amount of information we've managed to get, particularly seeing it's their information that's been leaked to us and sold to us through the data markets that have been used to expose kind of spies and stuff like that. And I think I would really like to see actually a lot more open source work being done in the UK and more organizations doing it, because I mean, the great work with freedom of information requests is extremely useful, and there's other ways to, crack those cases. And I think if there were more organizations who had a bigger open source element to it, they would do a lot better. I mean, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has also done brilliant work with open source material and combining it with their more traditional journalism methods. The BBC's been doing a lot of work with open source investigation, although that's mostly focused outside of the UK for the moment. But I hope more and more major UK news organizations start bringing to bear open source investigation on domestic topics, because I'm sure there's many things we can discover about certain people in certain streets in the middle of London.
Can I just jump in actually just a little bit on that, which is that, so with the Citizens, which I don't know, some people in the audience might know about, which is this organization which was sort of co-founded on a shoestring a couple of years ago. And with the crony contracts, it was, we're essentially, it was right at the very beginning. Good Law, obviously, we're very early in trying to sort of like unpeel it. And one of the things we did, it's just that we just grabbed a couple of guys off Twitter. So there's lovely Max, who was at the time working as a security guard in the Natural History Museum. And there's a guy called John Lubbock, who was doing various things, but he had a hobby as a Wikipedia editor. And essentially we kind of like brought them together and we're like, we were just like trying to figure out what was needed. And apart from anything else, we realized there was no actual central database of the contracts. They were all in these different government, things. And so they very painstakingly and methodically did an open source, put it all in an open source database, which was then available for anybody to use. And, it did get used by Byline, used it a lot, for their investigations. But it was also out there, and we weren't terribly good at advertising it. But the idea was that anybody could go in and have a look and try and then, as Russell was sort of saying, marry it up against other things. And we've just been, as I say, we've been doing this on a shoestring, but it has been about, finding talented sort of like investigators out on Twitter and then bring them together with some sort of traditional journalistic know-how of like how to turn this into a story. But we would love to. And in fact, we talked to Elliot more about doing some more workshops because what Bellingcat does is so brilliant. It feels like it's sort of Einstein level open source investigation. And we wanted to show actually there's things which anybody sitting at their kitchen table could have a go at, really. So we've still got that ambition. We just need a bit more money.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I will say that at Good Law Project, before Russ came on board, we did find the link between, IANDA Capital and the kind of, I don't think he was a fixer quite, but the person that helped to facilitate that contract, having formerly been on the board of Liz Truss's board of trade, simply through LinkedIn and Twitter. And, I remember sort of getting there about 2:00 in the morning, being like, found it. My husband, what are you doing?
That's so interesting, Gemma. And the other interesting thing about that, which is that the Twitter thread, because originally it was Jolyon did a Twitter thread, didn't he? And it was sort of like very brilliantly put down in that. Yeah. In some ways, I think these days the Twitter thread is kind of more engaging than a news article in some ways.
I mean, he's magnificent at doing them, but the most frustrating thing is when you sort of start off and he's doing them very slowly, and you're like, come on, he doesn't upload them all. Wait for this. Like, what? This is going to be good. What's coming? Thank you. That's really interesting. Should we move on to the next question? From Daniel. How have the panel reckoned with misogyny and a lack of diversity in open source journalism and tech media in general? I'm really glad somebody's asked this, because I have to say, Ellie, I was reading your book, which I loved, by the way. But at the beginning, I was sort of reading it. I'm like, there's no woman in this book. and then I got quite far into it, and I was so glad that you came on to address it. You acknowledged it completely, that actually the field lacks diversity, but then that Bellingcat had done some really amazing stuff to try and push back against that trend. Do you want to talk about that a bit? I know, Carol, obviously you've got a lot of experience of misogyny in this space as well.
I'll keep it brief because, I can speak to part of that. But it for me, it was really like recognizing that a lot of the people who are getting involved with this were white and male and quite nerdy. And that if we just didn't proactively seek out people who weren't like that, then we were going to end up with an entire kind of culture that was just based around that. And the field of open source investigation, it was a very small community that really grew from nothing and has grown over time. And I was in a position to be able to shape that and actually make the decision to not kind of go down that white and male route as much as possible. The one issue is that it's a self-selecting community in many regards, so that it attracts that kind of person. But it's very important to make sure that people who aren't fitting that kind of stereotype of an open source investigator, that kind of me basically, has a voice and is represented. And we've been very proactive about that when we're hiring with Bellingcat. We've also really focused on expanding the things. The way open source investigation developed was kind of very much through a development of a network around a certain topic in a certain language, in English. And what we're trying to do now is reach out to other parts of the world where there are networks of organizations who work together, on different topics. They're journalism networks, activism networks, and connect to them in places where it's outside of the kind of English language. We're doing work in Latin America at the moment and working with journalists there and training them and engaging with them. So we're giving them the skills to work. And I'm trying to avoid this relationship where Bellingcat becomes the only organization doing it. I want to give these skills away so people can go off and do it themselves and developing them themselves to fit their needs, rather than Bellingcat trying to develop things the way we think, because I don't know everything and not all my opinions are right. And it's good to let other people have a go and say, oh, actually, this thing's interesting. And it might be something that I haven't even thought about, but because we're spreading the kind of word of open source investigation, it empowers people who might otherwise, I hope, not feel like they can engage with that kind of work in the way that it might seem it is at the moment.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think it's so important to just to be thinking about it. Like, I think just so many people don't think about it, right? You could have kept on going and then realized that you'd had all this impact, but with a kind of a group of people with a fairly homogenous basis. So I think it's really impressive, and to your credit that you've thought about it and done something about it. Carol, do you have anything that you want to add on that?
I was just thinking, actually, I was just pondering on the somebody was telling me, I haven't seen it, there's a Netflix show, The Tinder Swindler.
Yeah, I haven't watched it yet.
There's different ways. I just kind of like, I think it's interesting, isn't it? There's different subjects and different ways that you can kind of like get different communities interested in open source investigation. And I think like tracking down these sleazy guys who are catfishing women on Tinder was sort of like, it's the same open source investigative methods, which you can then bring to other things possibly. But I don't know. One of the other things I think about, one thing which was like had a real impact on me was, which is a slight tangent, was I went to this brilliant conference for the Arabic Association of Investigative Journalists, and in that there was a talk actually by Elliot, one of your collaborators, Forensic Architecture, where they had sort of done this most amazing investigation into this prison in Syria, and by literally they interviewed the prisoners and about what they could hear, and then through constructing what they could hear, they figured out they figured out the architecture of the prison and then how many people were in there. And it was what was sort of amazing about it was this. So it's like it was approaching the problem in a completely different way. But what I thought was so insightful was this thing about how journalists who report in authoritarian countries are used to their governments lying to them, and they're used to not being able to sort of get information from official sources. So you have to find other means, and you have to report from the outside and figure out what's going in. And in Britain, so much of our reporting is from the inside and then taking it out. So all our political journalism is infected, and it is not to be trusted because it's coming from inside the machine, and it's totally prone to disinformation and to spin and whatever. And like I think that model of journalism in the current age that we live in, where politicians are prepared to lie and mislead and etc., is really problematic. And we've got to like really start thinking much more like the journalists from these Arabic countries or from autocratic countries like Russia, and treat those official source of information with, proper skepticism, and be more creative. Like that's one of the things, because I think being more creative, because so many, especially young people, they don't watch traditional news. We need to tell these kind of stories differently. And that again is something in our very grassrootsy kind of way we're trying to do at The Citizens with I'm a great fan of the TikTok explainer for news. So I've been trying to get some more people doing those. If there's any volunteers in the audience who wants to do a TikTok explainer for us.
Thanks, Carol. Let's move on to the next question. So it's from Ashley and Karen. So FOI is so important. Freedom of information request is so important. How does one overcome when a public institution simply does not respond or refuses to respond to a request? Is the FOI Act under threat? Russ, I'm going to come to you on that. That's all right. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I mean, the FOI Act is it certainly is under a threat in many regards. You know, the government deliberately set up clearinghouses where they, you know, take a request that's supposed to be applicant blind and they share it amongst themselves and decide how they're going to handle it or not handle it, and really slow the process down. And, you know, good laws, FOIs have ended up in that clearinghouse, and you can see it just takes months and months to get a response. And the answer is just to persevere. And you know, the idea that you're going to put a request in and get an answer back in 20 days now is just, unfortunately, a thing of the past, really, unless you're very lucky. So the idea is to persevere. And Carol and I mentioned it earlier, actually, it's just to get yourself a good sort of system, chase them up regularly, you know, put in your internal review requests, take them to the ICO. But it's certainly under threat. And I think there needs to be certainly more money, more resources pumped into the ICO. They need to be given more teeth to challenge government departments to get their act together, to respond in time. I also think of the way government redacts just about everything, and then you have to challenge that with our internal reviews and the ICO. There's that sort of deliberate slowing down of the process. So that does need to be challenged as well. I know there is supposed to be this sort of ongoing review into the clearinghouse and things like that. Yeah, it's not under threat or dead yet, but it definitely needs improving.
It's not dead yet. It just smells really funny, doesn't it?
But persevere is my answer to that. Just keep going, keep pushing.
It's pretty
Thank
dead.
you, Russ. Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? We get so much good material through FOI, so I can't say it's dead yet. It might be kind of, you know, barely alive on the floor, but it's not dead yet. But yeah, it's under threat for sure. It's a good question. I like that message of perseverance, though, Russ. So we've got one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. So it's from Alison. As you explain how you work and the people and interest that your work threatens become increasingly aware of how you do it, what are the biggest threats to your investigative work? Elliot, is that something that you would like to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the legal problems that are becoming more and more apparent. I mean, I'm being sued in the UK, but we also have legal challenges in Russia, although we're not too worried about those anymore, to be honest with you. It's like we were fined 500,000 rubles last week for not declaring our foreign agent status in Russia, and we're assuming they aren't going to be able to collect that anymore. And even if they can, it'll probably be about 50 quid at this point. So we're not too worried about that. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, even as people learn to kind of react to what we're doing and know our tricks, like, for example, Russia banned Russian soldiers from sharing information about their military service in a reaction to the work that we were doing. But we just went and looked at something else and discovered a new thing. There's so much information out there. It's not that we lack information. It's that we lack the kind of number of people to dig through it all and make it organized and investigate it. So if one avenue closes, then it opens up another one. And even though they might know, you know, our tricks in one country, we've certainly discovered if you go elsewhere in the world, this field of investigation isn't that well known that they can kind of predict what you can do. You can kind of get around the attempts at bad actors to prevent you from doing your work. And nothing really worries me. Well, there's so much opportunity out there to do it. It's mainly a matter of trying not to get sued so much that we don't have any money left to do investigations. Thank
you. That's super helpful. And I really appreciate the kind of message of positivity, because I think sometimes it's quite easy to get a bit disheartened by what's going on in the world, to be perfectly honest. But I think you've all shown that there's still so much more that we can do, and we can keep fighting. It's actually with great reluctance that I'm going to bring this evening to a close. I know we'd advertised a bit longer, but we have some other things that people need to do, I'm afraid, this evening. So I'm going to wrap things up. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear from Elliot, Carol, and Russ. So thank you to all of you for your time. They're all active on Twitter, as I think you've heard. I really recommend following them, as well as Carol. You should be following all the citizens as well. And I can also heartily recommend Elliot's book, We Are Bellingcat, which you can find in all good bookshops. And thank you to our audience for joining us and for asking such interesting questions. And thank you too for your continued support of Good Law Project. we literally couldn't do what we do without the support of the thousands of you, many thousands of you who donate each month, and the many, many more of you who share and amplify our messages on social media and offline as well. So if you'd like to hear more about the work that we do or future events, please do sign up to our mailing list. I'm not sure there's ever been a more important time, probably not in my life anyway, for ordinary people to use their voices, to use them really loudly, to speak truth to power, and to demand accountability. And I hope that you all feel as motivated and as activated as I do now. So happy weekends, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gemma.
Thank you.
Thanks.